told to be brief, which I find it very difficult to do, but I will try. But there's much to discuss here today, so much that we may have to reconvene tomorrow, and possibly even sometime next week, but I'll get back to you on that. With reference to the broad issue of the Second Amendment, there are two areas that I think we need to explore here today. First of all, the historical foundation of our right to keep and bear arms, which I will try to do as briefly as possible. And secondly, the fact that that right is now under assault as it has never been before in our history, and we need to discuss and consider how we can resist that assault if possible. With regard to the first area, that is history, as you all very well know, but many of our countrymen today seem to have forgotten, from the time the first British settlements were established on these shores in the early 17th century, right up till nearly the end of the 19th century, there were two basic indispensable tools that made survival and success in the howling wilderness of North America possible. And those were, of course, the axe and the rifle, or the musket. So ingrained in the character of this new race of people called Americans was this idea of gun ownership, that by the time of the Revolution, no one really gave much thought to the issue because it wasn't an issue. But when in September of 1787 the Constitutional Convention adjourned, without including in the new national charter specific guarantees of certain fundamental human rights, then it became an issue and people began to become concerned. 11 years earlier, you'll recall, Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence had spoken of several unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For the purposes of our discussion, the key phrase here is "among which," because it makes clear that Jefferson believed that there were many enumerated rights and many rights which had not been enumerated in the Declaration or even later in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. However, one right which is in fact enshrined there, as we all know, is the right to keep and bear arms. I'd like to be able to say that it is unambiguously guaranteed in the Second Amendment, but that would be misleading. In fact, it is the very ambiguity of the amendment that provides opponents of gun owners' rights, and by the way, guns have no rights, people have rights. Governments have powers, but governments have no rights. This is ammunition that the anti-gun people use to attack our rights with enthusiasm. As you know, and it's been stated here several times today, the amendment begins with a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. If members of the Congress had simply deleted that business about a well-regulated militia before they approved the wording, it's possible that all would have been well. But they didn't. And it isn't. Going back to September 1787, when the Constitution was sent out from the convention in Philadelphia to the states for their ratification, it appears that there was widespread concern about gun rights, even then. For example, in the Federalist 46 in 1788, James Madison wrote of, quote, "the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation." And we might add, they still do, for now. Not all of the state ratifying conventions made specific reference to the right of people to keep and bear arms, which finally does appear in the Second Amendment. But those states which did make reference were very specific, and unfortunately the Congress did not apparently take them at their word. For example, the ratification convention in New York State said, quote, "that the people have a right to keep and bear arms, semicolon, that a well-regulated militia, including the body of the people capable of bearing arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state." Notice that what came first was the right to keep and bear arms, and then the reference to a militia. The ratification conventions of Virginia and North Carolina, and I'm sorry to say not my own state of South Carolina, said basically the same thing, almost in verbatim terms. In short, there was widespread unanimity on this issue. But my favorite comes from the ratification of Little New Hampshire. And they said, quote, "Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion," which I think might just be put back. Well, so much for history. I hope that our discussion today will produce some suggestions about where we ought to go from here. One last thought. It's easy to read recent Supreme Court decisions such as were cited here earlier, the Heller decision, the McDonald decision in Chicago, within the last 4 years, as affirming our rights as individuals to bear arms. But before we become too euphoric about this, we need to remember that both of these decisions were 5-4 decisions. Unlike Brown versus Board of Education that was unanimous, one vote could have tipped the scales in the other direction, and given the way history is moving and politics are moving and the elderly people on the Supreme Court are moving, it's probable that these decisions will not stand. Finally, really, I offer without comment the following, and these things may very well be discussed further when we open the floor for discussion. A pundit recently has observed that dealing with this issue, that is gun rights, or the rights of gun ownership, that it is very much, quote, like juggling several bottles of nitroglycerin simultaneously, unquote. Make of that what you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Eichenbaum. Dr. Dan was a congressional candidate for Western North Carolina in 2008, and he also made another attempt in 2012, and we appreciate his time and efforts and so forth. And he has agreed to go ahead and make a PowerPoint presentation, if you can see the screen over here, on gun confiscation and personal freedoms.
I have to bring an audiovisual assistant all the way from Avery County. She's leaving.
I'll be back. Oh, you need me now?
You can't trust these people from Avery County. What can I tell you? Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for having me here today. It's great to be here and to see a lot of old friends. Not old in terms of age, but old in terms of people that I've known for a while. So I want to thank you for having me here. A man received by the way, could we turn a few of these lights off so we can see this? My very lovely wife made this PowerPoint presentation, and it's essential that you see that rather than see me. In any event, a man received a call from his doctor, and the doctor said to him, "Sir, I have bad news and worse news. Which would you like first?" The man said, "My God, that is the worst choice I've ever been given in my life. I guess you better give me the bad news." So the doctor said, "Well, here's the bad news. You only have 24 hours to live." The man said, "My God, what could be worse than that?" The doctor said, "I've been trying to find you for 23 hours. And I think that's about where we are in this country today. Right now, we're really at the 23rd hour. That's where we are. And I think this gun rights issue, the Second Amendment issue, is what's going to bring us to the cliff. So, It worked. You never know with these computers. Firearms in the hands of individual citizens represent the greatest single threat to tyrants, and they know it. By including the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights, our founders gave us the means to prevent the rise of a tyrannical central government, like the British dictatorship against which they had successfully rebelled, as well as the current version of the federal government and its bloated bureaucracy that has far exceeded its constitutionally enumerated powers, delimited in Article 1, Section 8. It's not as if this all hasn't happened before. Our collective ignorance of history and a disregard for its lessons will inevitably lead to the destruction of the true American dream, which is equality of opportunity and the true individual freedom that each citizen is due. In 1935, Adolf Hitler and the progressive Weimar Republic enacted universal gun registration laws. Hitler said, "This year will go down in history. For the first time, a civilized nation has full gun registration. Our streets will be safer, our police more efficient, and the world will follow our lead into the future." Extremely shortly thereafter, Dr. Werner Best, the Gestapo's second-in-command, wrote, "As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of the Jews represent a considerable danger for the German people." Confiscation of guns from Jews, dissidents, and other targeted groups quickly became the official government policy. Between 1939 and 1945, 13 million Jews, gypsies, and other undesirables, disarmed and unable to defend themselves, were arrested and exterminated. Disarming citizens has always been a prelude to slaughter, as proven by the fate of the Jews in Hitler's Germany, political dissidents in Stalin's Russia and Mao's China, the educated in Pol Pot's Cambodia, the Armenians in Turkey, and the Christians in Uganda, to name just a few. Well over 100 million dead innocents bear silent witness to the consequences of gun registration and the selective gun confiscation that inevitably follows. And here you see another quote from Adolf Hitler. So suppose we rewrite Dr. Best's statement in a generic form. As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of blank represent a considerable danger for blank. Once the concept of selective enforcement of gun laws is established, targeted groups of people unable to defend themselves can be singled out for extermination. Let's try a few. As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of the insane represent a considerable danger for the American people. How about another? As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of Iraq War veterans represent a considerable danger for the American people. Or how about, as a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of veterans who have ever had PTSD represent a considerable danger for the American people. Or how about, as a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of anyone who has seen a psychiatrist represent a considerable danger for the American people. As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of anyone who has ever taken prescription medications like Prozac represent a considerable danger for the American people. Or how about, As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of political protesters represent a considerable danger for the American people. I'm certain that you get the idea. It is easy to see how any repressive regime can use laws for the registration and confiscation of firearms as a means to control and enslave the population. For example, in the Soviet Union, dissidents were diagnosed by their doctors, by government doctors, as insane. And then, unable to protect themselves because of gun confiscation, they were incarcerated for life in mental institutions. Now look, don't tell me that it can't happen here. In February 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, one executive order from FDR led to the incarceration without habeas corpus of 110,000 American citizens of Japanese descent in what we would now call FEMA camps. It is an undeniable fact of history. Universal gun registration leads to selective gun confiscation, which leads to the slaughter of targeted innocents who are unable to protect themselves from an armed totalitarian government. Those pictures of those Japanese American citizens don't look that much different from the Jews in Hitler's concentration camp. It can happen here, and it will. During colonial times, the British governors could arrest and detain anyone indefinitely for speaking or writing ill of King George. Habeas corpus was non-existent. British soldiers could also occupy a person's home or demand search and seizure of the home by simply writing out a warrant on the spot without any judicial authorization. The first 8 amendments in the Bill of Rights, the result of those abuses of executive power by King George and the colonial authorities, were written to protect us, we the people, as individuals, from the abusive power of the government. We have seen an unprecedented attack on privacy rights through RICO, the various iterations of the Patriot Act, the Warner Act, the NDAA, the Expatriation Act, the National Defense Resources Preparedness Executive Order, all of which give the federal government authority to conscript all persons of critical experience without pay and to nationalize all productive capacity and resources within the United States for distribution domestically and abroad. That gives the government the power to take anything it wants from anyone for any reason it invents. Red light cameras, video surveillance in public places, full body scanners at airport security, Google Street View, electronic medical records, and the recently added specter of unmanned drones with attack capabilities all represent a gross usurpation of power by the government that is blatantly unconstitutional. I would remind you, unbridled police power is the hallmark of a totalitarian state. Thank you.
Do we have the lights back on? Hey, Jen. At this point, we will begin with the question and answers. And as moderator for today's event, I'd like to explain what we feel would be appropriate ground rules. Number one, if you have a question, we want you to raise your hand, and you'll be given a number. We have the 2 ladies here who will pass these out. The numbers will be called in sequence. When your number is called, please stand. You'll be given the microphone. Give your name and your county of residence. You may direct your question to a specific panel member or state it as an open panel response. For any who would prefer to write your question, please ask one of our assistants here for a paper and pencil. and I'll be happy to read that. And before we begin, I would like everyone to either turn their cell phone off or put it in the vibrate mode. And I appreciate that. So, who is lucky candidate number 1 here that would like to ask a question?
I will.
You can continue raising your hand. We'll pass. You don't have to wait until that one's complete. Thank you.
I have one last question.
Please,
know that.
yes.
Not terrible information, but sorry, there you go. Can you hear me now? Do you know that the health care bill also is involved with the gun? It said they talk about relating to the Health Care Portability Act. They talk about relating to the Health Care Insurance Portability Act, and also the Center for Disease Control. All these are the health care bill that the federal government passed also takes away all of our rights, also including our gun rights. It's in the federal government has actually labeled most of Americans as mentally disturbed. Believe it or not, that's the absolute truth. So I want you to be aware of that and what our state representatives and their senators to do about that kind of action against the people of the federal government.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, we'd like a comment, a response by Dr. Eichenbaum.
I want to thank you very much for making that comment. As a physician, I'm very well aware and dealing with on a daily basis the Obamacare Act. Anyone who wants to see it, I've got about a 40-minute presentation on Obamacare. Basically, it is a bill that is designed to limit the availability and the quality of health care to everybody in this room. It should not be any secret to you. First of all, you should know that the entirety of your health care records, including your personal information, is directly available to the federal government. Anything that you tell your doctor, anything, is available to the federal government. If they ask you, do you have guns in your home, which they're starting to ask you, and you say yes, then the federal government knows that you have guns in your house. So, anything that you tell your doctor is now available to the federal government. Pardon?
That's not. That's absolute truth too. But what I'm saying though is that they are labeling people as mentally disabled, mentally disturbed people, so they can take their guns away from them, and so they'll have a reason to take everybody's guns away from even sheriffs and all. Nobody is exempt from this mentally disabled or mentally ill. Have you ever asked, how does the federal government know how many people are going to get such and such a disease every year?
Thank you. Number 2, please bear with us. We didn't practice this.
Again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and seeing the number of young people here today really warms my heart. I'm a lifetime member of the NRA, veteran, concealed carry permit for, I guess, since it really first got started. Had the opportunity to travel this past year about 6,500 miles and carried a pistol in my pocket everywhere I went. So I found out Thursday night when researching the Second Amendment and the right to carry and the reciprocal states and the different problems or the difference between each state in to carry a weapon, I should be in prison right now. I broke about 500 laws last summer. My problem is there's so many states that have reciprocal agreements, can carry, will carry, I sort of like Montana's view of it. Shall carry. My problem is so many places you can't carry a concealed weapon. And the majority of those places are the places I feel most uncomfortable.
Sir, where do you reside in your name? I'm sorry.
Oh, Mickey Swan, I live right here.
Okay. Thank you. Number 3.
Meeting number 4. We got, it's even numbers only at the moment.
Okay. Number 4. Name and residence, please.
Thank you. My name is Joe Scott. My wife and I live here in Yancey County and directed primarily to the sheriffs. I appreciate both of you gentlemen very much. Last week, the sheriff of Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, came under fire for making what I thought was a pretty courageous statement that he urged citizens to, instead of your first idea, if you're under immediate personal threat, to call 911. Instead, make sure that you have had a firearm safety course and you are prepared to defend yourself. I would just, I guess this is a question or a request. I would urge you gentlemen, if you agree, to maybe work that into your communications with citizens in our counties, and just to get the message out that we do need to be prepared to protect ourselves. While 911 is obviously extremely valuable service that we have, it may not be our best option in an immediate situation. Thank you.
Number 5. No, sorry. Number 6.
Yes. My name is Charles Kaprowitz-Kasper. I'm the National Director for the Citizen Initiatives. I'm also directing the single-issue amendment conventions for selected amendments. And this perhaps is something that the constitutional scholar would like to address. We have about 16 different amendments that we are advancing through state legislatures under Article 5 for the purpose of amending the U.S. Constitution and to protect our constitutional rights. Now, for the last 50 years, there has been a lot of criticism and flawed constitutional thinking regarding conventions as an option under Article 5. We are advancing this, including restoration of the Second Amendment. The idea is that, as this gentleman just said a little while ago, you don't know what to do with your gun. You go here, it's okay, you go there, it's not okay. But that's true for the Balanced Budget Amendment, that kind of problem. That's true for the Unborn Child Amendment, for traditional marriage, and a whole host of other issues that we, for too long, have put aside and not confronted. Under citizen initiatives, we can amend the U.S. Constitution and re-empower the states to be the enforcement vehicles of these constitutional rights, rather than depending on the federal government to negate state law. But that can be done through Article 5. So I want to offer that as an option for us to consider. And if you would like to make comments on it, you're welcome. Our website is citizeninitiatives.org. Thank you.
I'd like to go back to the gentleman's question about traveling 6,500 miles and direct it to either of our sheriffs as far as what their understanding is with reference to carrying a concealed weapon within, let's just say, the East Coast. I know in the past, traveling up and down the East Coast, there were reciprocal agreements, but with every state except for Maryland. Has that changed?
If I was going to go on a trip like that and I had a concealed carry, you know, I can't sit here and tell you which states is reciprocal to us. What I would definitely do is I'd look on the internet and I'd check and see. I've got a handout at the Sheriff's Office that shows that, and I'm sure that Gary does too, because we got it from the Sheriff's Association. But, you know, just pay attention to that, because you wouldn't want to do anything to jeopardize your concealed carry. Also watch whenever you go in your buildings, because there's so many buildings anymore that has a sign up too. You know, the restaurants, you know, if they serve the alcoholic beverages, I think they're getting ready to change some of the laws on that. But, you know, most of your restaurants serves alcoholic beverages anymore, but you know, you're not going there to cause trouble, and you should be able to have your guns.
Don't know if it'd be off topic or not, but, you know, I've spoke with many people who have the concealed carry weapons permit, and they tell me that the reason they've got their concealed carry weapons permit is because they can get them. And I want to encourage them to carry their gun, because a lot of people who get their concealed carry weapons permit, they don't carry their firearm. They do not do you any good on the nightstand at home when you're out here traveling. And as far as the reciprocal states, I would have to go with Donald. We have some paperwork at our offices, and you can go online and see which states are reciprocal. But you know, once it gets outside North Carolina, I really don't keep up with the laws. But I've got Ray Anglin here is in the back. He's my administrative sergeant, and he is the one that issues all of the concealed carry weapons permit, and also got Bradley Boone, who's administrative assistant. Just want to point them out in the back. If you got any gun permit questions, those are the two guys in my office that get about 99.9% of the questions. But to go back to encourage a person to carry, I do not encourage a person to carry who's not familiar with your gun. I think that you would you need to be very familiar with the gun that you're going to carry. There are stories of police officers from back in training, basic training 25 years ago for me, where we would hear horror stories about officers who would be issued a gun that they were not familiar with, and they would get into a confrontation with an assailant, and they would be fighting with the assailant, and the assailant would know more about their gun than they did. They'd grab a hold of the slide on top of the gun while the officer's trying to shoot the person off of them that's beating them or stabbing them, and they didn't know enough about their own gun or how to protect their own gun to defend themselves with their gun. So, you know, I think we have a responsibility to keep our guns out of the hands of children. I mean, I think we can all agree on that. But I think that we all have a responsibility, along with gun ownership, to know how to use your gun and be prepared to use your gun. Know when to shoot and know when not to shoot. It's not going to do you any good in your nightstand at home.
Thank you, Sheriff.
I'm reminded by the sheriff's comments of a man who had tickets to go to a concert at Carnegie Hall in New York City, and he was wandering around and he was lost, and he saw this guy walking around with a violin case, and he figured he might know where Carnegie Hall was, so he came up to him and, "Sir," he said, "how do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And the guy said, "Practice." I would like to inform you there is an organization in North Carolina, grnc.org, which is an excellent organization. They were very active in getting the Castle Doctrine passed the last session, and also they have negotiated reciprocal carry agreements, I believe, with 43 out of the 57 or 58 states. But if you go to their website, they do have information on reciprocity with other states. grnc.org, a very worthwhile organization.
Thank you, Doctor. Number 8.
Thank you, and thank you to the ARW for hosting this important workshop. And I don't want to get into political issues, but I don't know how to ask this question without touching on the political issue. And
What about your name?
my name is Clint Pollard. I'm the editor of the Blue Ridge Christian News. My wife Kay and I live in Minpro, right outside Spruce Pine. I'm thinking about running for mayor of Minpro. Actually, my question relates to this. We have seen, particularly sheriffs, in the case of immigration and customs, You know, there are laws on the books in virtually all of the states, and there are federal laws against illegal immigration. Yet, the administration that currently sits in Washington and controls our government has chosen in many instances to call law enforcement off and to in fact set aside some of the laws that govern movement across our borders. And my concern about Second Amendment and gun control is this. Should an administration choose to take measures to involve themselves at the federal level in taking away our Second Amendment rights, how do you fellows, as the sheriff of Mitchell and Yancey County, imagine that you would deal with that if you were in conflict with federal mandate?
Thank you, Clint.